The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, No IDA with Precision, presented by Ann Wilson. My name is Pam Christie, PTI Director at Peak Parent Center, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you are connected to today's webinar through the internet, you should see your attendee interface or control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your own computer's desktop. By default, you are listening in to today's webinar using your computer speaker system. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane of your control panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions in the question pane of the control panel. You may also add questions in the chat, and we will be monitoring both. We'll address the questions as we go, and at the end if there's time. There are some handouts available. There's 3 in the handout pane. Please download those before the end of this webinar. As you leave today's webinar, you will receive an evaluation survey about the presentation. We would greatly appreciate if you would just take a minute to complete that and provide your feedback. So again, welcome to today's webinar, No IDA with Precision, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ann, who will take it from here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar today. My name is Ann Wilson, as Pam said. I work with Peak Parent Center on this alternative dispute resolution project, as well as on the shift transition project and with the Parent Training and Information Center. My connection to the IEP process is as a parent of a child facility who went through the early intervention program and on to special education at the age of 3. This is the first of a series of 3 webinars on improving IEP teams that was planned before COVID-19 hit. The webinars present parts of the one-day training and facilitated skills, and the content does not deal with issues presented by COVID-19 directly, but the general concepts covered should be applicable to the development of IEPs under these circumstances as well. This is my very first webinar, so please be patient with me if I struggle with the technology. Today's webinar focuses on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or DEA. The trainings that are the basis for these webinars are interactive, so I've tried to incorporate some of the activities into the webinar. I encourage you to make use of the chat box, but understand if you don't want to participate in that way as well. So before we get started, I want to get a sense of the IDEA for those of you who joined the webinar today. So if you don't mind noting in the chat box any of your level of experience, and also if you have had an IEP meeting held by video or teleconference. In my own experience, I've found that my awareness of the specifics of IDEA varied a lot over the years, as my attention was more often directed to trying to understand my child's disability and related challenges, as well as managing the day-to-day needs of my family. When this was going well at school, I wasn't worried about the details of IDEA, and so it was only when issues arose that I would pay more attention to it. But often I just relied on the advice of others, which was not always accurate. This webinar is presented in conjunction with the Colorado Department of Education's Alternative Dispute Resolution Project. In 2013, CDE recognized from parent and educator feedback the need for more options to prevent IEPs from moving into dispute processes and to result in better outcomes for students. The Alternative Dispute Resolution Advisory Board was formed to look at best practices across the U.S. in alternative dispute resolution and decide where Colorado should start. As a result of this work, it was decided that IEP facilitation was a highly promising practice that could work well in Colorado's local control model. Today's webinar will begin with some background on the ADR project and facilitated IEPs. Then we'll go over some key IDEA terminology and concepts, some basic IEP meeting fundamentals, and we'll end with how to request a facilitator for IEP meetings. One disclaimer, Peak Parent Center is an information agency and not a legal services agency. So this webinar is presented for informational purposes and does not provide any legal advice. So as you can see, the mission of the project is to provide tools to all stakeholders to increase collaboration and improve the IEP process. In addition to trainings held throughout the state, this webinar is a means to increase awareness of the program and the tools for collaboration. So what were some of the issues identified that this program is intended to address? Maybe some of you have had an experience that felt like the picture on this slide. Sometimes IEP meetings don't go so well. What CDE found was that most special education conflict centers around the development of the IEP. There's a natural imbalance of power in the structure of the IEP meeting that often results in parents feeling undervalued. The members of the team, including the school staff, administrators, and parents, often become focused on the disagreement and engaged in a relationship of conflict rather than focusing on creating the best supports for the child. And the cost in both dollars and emotional toll of conflict is very high. This figure of $90 million is outdated, but we know that the current figure is higher. So when presented with this problem, we have a quote from Albert Einstein: "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." As I mentioned, the Alternative Dispute Resolution Advisory Board identified the use of facilitative skills to be a promising practice. And that the use of facilitative skills in all meetings was helpful, as well as the use of an impartial third-party facilitator in meetings. Facilitation is an optional resolution process where the parties agree to have an impartial facilitator assist the team with communication and problem solving. We've also found that the more team members that are aware of facilitative skills and use them in meetings can also help prevent teams from needing to bring in a facilitator. So some of the benefits of facilitation, and this is from the American Bar Association. First, the parties get to decide. The group continues to work together to reach consensus rather than having a third party decide what the outcome will be. Facilitation fosters continuing relationships because you work through the issues in the meetings rather than sort of separating and handling them separately. The facilitation process allows the conversations to deal with some of the feelings that are important when dealing with a child in special education, and it keeps the focus on the child. They've found that outcomes are more durable through facilitation, and the process is lower cost in terms of financial and human energy. The facilitation process is also free to parents. Some parents have been confused about how a facilitator differs from different supporters in the process, such as an advocate. So facilitation is impartial. The facilitator does not represent any party or their interests. They're focused on the process. So they're not content experts. They're helping you through the process. The people on the team remain the experts on the content. And both the parents and the district must agree to facilitation. So it's possible that one party could ask for facilitation, but the other party might not agree, and then you would not be able to go forward with facilitation. This is also the reason that the facilitator contacts both parties at the same time. rather than one before the other. They're trying to remain totally impartial. So the difference is it's not an advocate representing one side. It's not a mediator who will choose between the two sides. It's not a legal process. And again, it's not a third party deciding who wins or who loses. So one of the things that has been identified as a source of tension in the IEP process is a lack of knowledge of basics. So today we are looking at some IDEA basics that impact the IEP process and meetings. The first thing we're going to talk about is terminology. There are some terms and concepts that are critical to the IEP process and to the intent of the IDEA. Another term you should be familiar with in Colorado is local control. Unlike many other states, the Colorado Constitution and our state laws give much authority to administer schools to the local districts. So many decisions on issues such as curriculum, graduation requirements, classroom policy, et cetera, may be determined at the district level. So this may be why in informal conversations, you may have a friend in another district who's getting something for their child who has a similar diagnosis, but that your district isn't offering. So IDEA has extensive procedural requirements as well as substantive requirements designed to ensure that the child receives a free appropriate public education. IDEA makes available to eligible children with disabilities a free appropriate public education, which we'll refer to as FAPE. FAPE is defined as special education and related services provided in conformity with an individualized education program and is provided in the least restrictive environment. So I'm noticing we're not having any participation in the chat box, but as I go over these terms in more detail, and if you think of things that they make you think of, please go ahead and enter those in the chat box. When conflict arises, a central issue is often what the school district has provided FAPE. And as we provide these trainings, we find that a lot of times people feel like the knowledge of FAPE is not as strong as people would like it to be. So that's a reason for this webinar. So free, appropriate, and public education means special education and related services at public expense delivered in conformity with the IEP in the least restrictive environment. To meet the requirements of FAPE, the IEP should be reasonably calculated to produce educational benefit. And it should provide a basic floor of opportunity. FAPE, the concept of appropriate public education is important because FAPE refers to some educational benefit, not the best education possible or one that maximizes the benefit to our child. This is a really important concept to be aware of because when we talk about what we want for our kids, we usually think in terms of what is best, not some educational benefit. We all want the best for our kids, no matter what our role, but that's not what the law defines and not how the system operates. This is where tension begins to be created in the IEP process and where we as IEP team members must be creative and focus on the needs of each child to ensure that what they get from their education is as meaningful and meets their needs as much as possible within the framework. The standard for determining an appropriate public education was first addressed by the U.S. Supreme Court in Board of Education of the Hendrick Hudson Central School District versus Rallye. In that case, the court applied a two-part test to determine the appropriateness of the student's education. These two key factors were, has the state complied with the procedures set forth in the IDEA? And the second part is the IEP developed through the IDEA's procedures reasonably calculated to enable them to receive the court in Rallye did not set forth a specific test, so following the Rallye decision, courts applied language from the decision in a variety of ways. They differed on what the level of educational benefit was appropriate, ranging from some educational benefit to meaningful benefit. Until recently, the 10th Circuit, where Colorado is located, followed one of the lower standards along the lines of a just above trivial benefit. But in 2017, the Supreme Court addressed the conflict in the lower courts as to what level of educational benefit is intended, particularly looking at the 10th Circuit standard. In the Andrew F. case from Douglas County, the opinion had used the language merely more than de minimis as the level of benefit. The Supreme Court ruled that that public school students with disabilities are entitled to greater benefits than the 10th Circuit had determined. And here's some language from the court. The US Supreme Court determined that when providing special educational services to students with disabilities, school systems cannot simply ensure that a student makes minimal or trivial progress from year to year, but instead must ensure that students make meaningful progress given the student's circumstances. So here's some additional language from the case. When all is said and done, a student offered an educational program providing merely more than de minimis progress from year to year can hardly be said to have been offered an education at all. The IDEA demands more. It requires an educational program reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. An educational program must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom. So this decision was very positive, and it gave more guidance, and in the 10th Circuit increased the standard for what an appropriate education was. For more information on FAPE, there is a handout of an article called What's Covered Under FAPE. So what is special education? Special education means specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability and to ensure access to the general curriculum. This instruction includes instruction in the classroom, but also at the home where we are all learning now, and as well as in hospitals and institutions and other settings. The specially designed instruction is not limited to academic subjects. It also includes instruction in physical education. So what is specially designed instruction? Specially designed instruction means adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the student resulting from the disability and ensure access to the general curriculum so that the student can meet the standards that apply to all children. The goal is to adapt instruction so that they can meet the standards for all kids. The content of the IEP needs to tie to the general standards. Special education should not create an alternative universe for kids with disabilities and should tie as close as possible to the experience of typical kids while meeting the student's individual needs. Again, the statute requires special education and related services. Related services means transportation and such developmental, corrective, and other supportive services as are required to assist a child to benefit from special education. So this includes speech language pathology, audiologist services, interpreters, psychological services, physical therapy, occupational therapy, things like that. And what is the least restrictive environment, which we often call the LRE? There's a strong preference for children with disabilities to be educated with children without disabilities. The word maximum is used 3 times in the regulations about least restrictive environment. We want, to the maximum extent appropriate, we want children with disabilities to be educated with children who are non-disabled, to be able to participate in extracurricular activities with children who are non-disabled, and to receive supplementary aids and services to make this possible. Supplementary aids and services might include something like preferential seating or extended time for testing or other things that need to make the general classroom accessible to them. Because there's such a strong preference for children with disabilities to learn with their non-disabled peers, it's really important to have reasons to explain placements away from non-disabled peers. As a note of caution, it's easy to confuse placement in the least restrictive environment with the location where services are delivered. Location is different, and it should not be used interchangeably with least restrictive environment. So we always want to think about students receiving special education as general education students first. With that in mind, look at this diagram. So the target in the center is the general education curriculum for all students. Special education supports the general curriculum, and related services sort of support and wrap around special education. As we think about FAPE, we want to keep that structure in mind. And again, conflict often arises between the school's obligation for reasonable educational benefit and what a parent believes is best for their child. The focus on the needs of the child and educational benefit are critical. Okay, so as a parent, we hear a lot of conversation. We get a lot of advice on things that we should be looking for and what kind of things that we should be expecting in our IEP. And I know that I didn't spend much time thinking about, well, what's the source of this? Where is this coming from? What's the legal basis for asking for this? So this is an exercise that we do in the full day training, which I found really interesting and helpful. And so to the extent we can try and do this online, some of the things you may have heard, we have a list of terms here on the slide, and we try to place those terms, whether they're part of FAPE, whether they're part of the least restrictive environment, whether they're part of special education, or whether there's something that's valuable, but actually not something that's required under the law. So those terms include measurable annual goals, inclusion, state standards, general curriculum, non-disabled peers. So you've probably heard a lot of these terms. So let's look at just a few of these and see where they might fall. And if anyone wants to enter in the chat box where they might place some of these, or I'll just talk about some of them. So for example, when we talk about general education, what's the source of that? For general education, we would put that under special education, because special education is specially designed instruction to meet the needs of the child and ensure access to the general curriculum. So general curriculum sort of relates to the special education box. Something like non-disabled peers, if you remember from the least restrictive environment, there's a strong preference to maximize the time that the child with a disability spends with non-disabled peers. So non-disabled peers relates to the least restrictive environment. A concept that we talk a lot about at Peak Parent Center, we actually have a conference called the Inclusion Conference, is a really important value, but inclusion is actually not part of the law. So for this exercise, it would go under the discard pile. It's an important value and something we really want our child to be included, but the concept of inclusion is kind of an outcome of the child with disabilities being educated with non-disabled peers. Another term that comes up a lot is wanting our child to be educated in their neighborhood school. We just think that's an important value, and that's actually another discard. There's nothing that says that the child should be educated in the neighborhood school, even though that's a really important value. So on these terms that come up in the discard pile, we need to kind of think about, well, how does that apply? And so if we want inclusion, we might think about how does that tie in with having experiences with non-disabled peers or in the general ed classroom. So here's where the words fall. Under FAPE, these concepts of in light of the child's circumstances, appropriately ambitious, basic floor of opportunity, state standards, no cost to parent, that's the easy one, free, some educational benefit, and unique needs of students. Most of these concepts come out of the opinions of courts that have interpreted IDEA. For the least restrictive environment, the concept of non-disabled peers, supplementary aids and services, extracurricular activities, and to the maximum extent appropriate. Under special education, we find related service, behavior intervention plans, measurable annual goals, specially designed instruction, general curriculum, extended school year, continuum of alternative placements, present levels of performance, methodology, and frequency and duration. And finally, our discard pile. These are some things that we care about and we want for our child, but they're not articulated in the law. That includes good grades, what is best for the student, justification, classroom location, mainstream, guarantee of progress, inclusion, parental preference, and neighborhood school. So when I did this exercise, I found it really interesting because there were things that I thought of as things I really wanted in my IEP, but I hadn't actually thought about what the source under the law was for those things. So I hope that you found that exercise interesting. Next, we're going to talk about some fundamentals of the IEP team. To have productive IEP team meetings, we must all understand the fundamentals and the function of the IEP team. And the goal of the IEP team really is to have all these people with different perspectives come together to develop the plan of supports for the student. The core of the IEP process is a well-functioning team, and to function effectively, you must have a properly constituted team, and the parents have a right to participate, and that is a key procedural safeguard of IDEA. The parents are always invited, and hopefully parents want to participate. There may be instances where a parent does not want to participate, but the schools need to make reasonable efforts to make sure that the parent has the opportunity to participate and has been given notice, and that the school has made an effort to include them. Even if a school has an order against a parent being at the school, they may have to have the meeting offsite, because an order against a parent being at the school doesn't trump their right to be at the IEP meeting. Schools can't force the parent to only participate remotely, though under current circumstances, everybody's participating remotely, so that's a different situation. Also, if you do have a remote meeting, the facilitators are available to facilitate remote meetings. So if that's an interest, they're still available. It's also important to know who the parent is for IEP purposes. And the school need to go through and make sure they're meeting with the right person, the person who has that right. And if you're a parent who's been through a divorce, you also want to check to make sure that you're aware of which parents can attend the IEP meetings. Education decisions are part of legal custody, which is different from physical custody. So you want to make sure that if both parents still have a right to participate, that they are both invited to the meetings. So again, attendance, the annual IEP must be developed by a properly constituted IEP team. The IDEA has rules about excusing members of the IEP team from meetings, and parent consent in writing is required to excuse a team member from attending the meeting. So we'll look at that in more detail. First of all, if anyone wants to enter anything in the chat box, just some questions. If anyone has any ideas how many people are required to be at an IEP meeting, and we always like to find out what the largest number of people you've had in attendance at an IEP meeting is, just because the number can range, and some people have had some really large IEP meetings. So in general categories, the IEP team doesn't have a specific number, but there are key roles that must be represented. And we'll look at those in more detail. But basically that includes the parents, an administrator, meaning someone who can commit resources, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, and the role of evaluation personnel. The meeting may also include the student. Many parents like to bring their student to the meeting. At a certain age, when you begin discussing transition, the student is required to be invited. You can always have people with knowledge or expertise about the student come to the meeting. And at certain stages, you'll also have transition service agency representatives. So in more detail, the parents of the child, and that means the parent is always invited, and you want to make sure you've made every effort to include them in the meeting. Not less than one regular education teacher of the child, if the child is or may be participating in the regular education environment. So this needs to be a teacher, a general ed teacher who has taught the child. If the student isn't participating in the general ed classroom, then you would not have that person. Not less than one special education teacher of the child, or where appropriate, not less than one special education provider of the child. So if your child is in has a special education teacher, that person would come. But sometimes a student might not have a special education teacher. They might have only a speech language provider. So that would fill that role in that case. A representative of the public agency, and that's what the prior slide referred to as administrator. This is someone who can provide or supervise special education and commit the resources of the school. You don't want to have the team meeting and have it up in the air whether something you're agreeing to will be possible. And so that's why that's important to have that person there. And an individual who can interpret the instruction implications of evaluation results. This is someone who can help the team in determining appropriate special education and supports. It does not have to be the person who conducted the assessment. That may vary. And so while all these roles are required, one person may fill more than one role. For example, a special education teacher is typically trained to interpret test data. So that person could fill both the special education teacher and the evaluation personnel role. And that may vary depending if it's an eligibility meeting or an annual IEP meeting. There may be more data to review at a eligibility meeting, and you may have someone specific to that role. But they don't have to each be an individual person, and if they are a required person, they need to be there for the entire meeting. It does occur, I know that I've had this happen, that someone has to leave the meeting early, and if that person's input is essential to what you're deciding, you may need to reconvene at another time when that person can be there. But if the person is leaving early, you'll need to consent to that, and it's probably something that you want to note in the conference notes that someone left early. Also, just make sure when you're in a meeting to make sure you know who everyone at the table is and what the role is. Often you'll have introductions, and if you're in a virtual meeting, you especially want to know who's at the table. Make sure everyone who's participating is supposed to be there, and that everyone's making efforts to maintain the confidentiality of what's happening at the meeting. Sorry, just a little trouble with the slide. So more about the parents' right to participate. Parents have a right to be involved in all IEPT decisions regarding FAPE and placement in the LRE. The right to participate is guaranteed. Ideally, decisions will be reached through consensus at the IEP team meeting, but sometimes that's not possible. And when the team is unable to reach consensus on a plan, it is the school's obligation to propose an IEP that provides FAPE. The parents do have a right to object to the school's proposal, but it's just important to remember that participation is not the same as the right to disagree. You can disagree, but the IEP team needs to spend its time using its skills to help reach consensus and keep the focus on the child's needs. So parents have the right to provide input. Often you may, different schools approach this different ways, different teams approach this different ways. Someone might just call and ask you, you might get an email. The facilitators have this parent input form, which is another one of your handouts. And that's a nice form where you can go through this list of questions to provide input on student strengths, behavioral performance, social interaction, and parent concerns. And even if you provide your input in a different format, it's nice to just go through these questions to make sure you've covered all these points. This parent input will be particularly important right now when students are working from home, because parents have the most opportunity to observe what's happening. Some advice I've been given is to try to keep track of things that happen when they happen. I've heard people recommend that during this unusual time, you document what supports are being given to your child, and also note your concerns, areas where you might feel like they're at risk of falling behind. I know that there is a lot of concern out there about students falling behind during this time of unusual instruction. So it's a good idea to keep notes as things are happening. So again, parent input is a fundamental part of the IEP process, and schools want to make sure that a parent is involved to avoid predetermination. Predetermination is a concept of schools making decisions on FAPE or placement decisions without involving the parents. And so if predetermination occurs, then the school is likely to have denied FAPE. Not every meeting of the school staff is an IEP meeting. The staff may have meetings to prepare, but when there is a placement decision or an IEP determination without parents, that's when predetermination occurs. An example might be if the school creates the IEP and just presents it to the parents as final at the meeting, then ask them to sign. That would be predetermination because the parents haven't been given an opportunity to provide input. They haven't been involved in the drafting. So courts have found that predetermination is a denial of FAPE because it denies the parents' right to participate in the IEP process. Courts have also found that the right to meaningful input is not the same thing as the right to dictate the outcome. So there's somewhat of a balance there, but not having parent participation rises to the level of a substantive violation and can open the door to legal remedies, which again involves time, expense, and emotional energy, all resources that we want to direct more toward the children if we can. So, avoiding predetermination. The main way to avoid predetermination is to involve the parents. And we find that planning and communication are essential in that regard, because you really want to get input from all team members in advance, find out what issues you may have, or even what the concerns are, what things you're looking to address. One of the tools that facilitators use when they are working at a meeting is the development of an agenda before the meeting. But this is something that anyone can do. Surprisingly, many people have reported that their meetings don't have a specific agenda. And so that's something that people can work into the process easily that we find a lot of people haven't been using. A lot of times, people may just use the IEP draft sort of as the agenda and work through it. But sometimes IEP meetings can run long or get off track. And so an agenda really helps to make sure that we find out ahead of time what everyone is thinking and what they want to accomplish at the meeting. And it also gives parents and others a chance before the meeting to think about what they want. If you're a parent and you have a meeting come up and you've not been asked for input, consider checking in with your case manager about what you can do to prepare for the meeting, or if there is an agenda, so that you can be involved in that process. It's common for teams to overestimate what can be done in a meeting. Often there are a lot of IEP meetings to be scheduled, and time is a scarce commodity. So sometimes there's a lot to be done in what feels like a short amount of time. And so an agenda can help keep groups on track. Also, when planning for the meetings, it's important to think about what the team's history is and the complexity of the work to be done. So it's also important to be, even though there are time constraints, be realistic about what needs to be done and how much time it's likely to take. I know that sometimes it's hard to be, it's hard to schedule all the IEPs, and you know that your team has a lot of heavy caseload, but it also is important that the work be done well. And so if it's okay to ask for reconvening or having the team get back together. And again, although we're talking mainly about annual IEP meetings in this webinar, facilitators are available for any meeting related to the IEP. or even if the team is getting together to talk about an issue. So the facilitation doesn't only apply to the annual IEP meeting. And this is another tool that facilitators use. In the facilitation process, visuals are really helpful. The facilitators will do a lot of charting so that people can see what's ahead and what people have brought up. If there's a point that's going to be addressed later, they can write that down. And having those visuals really helps to keep track of what needs to be addressed later so it doesn't get lost. And this FAPE continuum is a tool that facilitators often use. This outlines the topics to be covered in the meeting. Even if you're in a meeting where they aren't using this, it's helpful just to kind of keep in mind what the meeting's going to cover. And if there is a facilitator using this meeting, they can also keep track of points. Sometimes meetings will jump around, like you'll start to talk about something in evaluation, and then someone will say, oh, we should have a goal for that, and then the conversation will move to goals, and then sometimes you may not get back to the evaluation, or things like this can happen. Or sometimes you're talking about something and someone says we should have a goal for that, and then someone will say we'll talk about that later, but then that might get forgotten. So this chart can kind of keep you on track of when you'll talk about certain things. You can also put notes on there, or even keep your own note about something like when we get to goals, I want to talk about this. If you bring up a concern in a meeting and are worried that it's going to, it might be forgotten, you can also ask whoever's running the meeting to make a note of it to be sure that it isn't lost. And this is another tool that the facilitators use that's really helpful when starting out a meeting. Often conflict occurs because of a lack of information. So when you're preparing for the meeting or when the meeting begins, you want to make sure that you have all the information that you need. And sometimes things can be missed because, for example, say a student moves from one district to another and the timing of certain screenings are done differently. And so something like a vision screening might be missed. So ideally, if you could go over before the meeting what what information you need to make sure you have everything, but sometimes that will happen in the meeting, or an issue will come up and you might not have data on that particular issue. So then you might need to go gather that data. But without a clear understanding of the student's educational needs, you can't actually develop a plan that gives them the free, appropriate public education. So this is just kind of a tool that you can go through and look at each category. Do we have all the health, vision, or hearing? Do we need cognitive testing? Do we have the academic skills information we need? Also looking at communication, social emotional skills, functional skills, physical or motor skills. Sometimes if you have a student that you have a particular concern, it's easy to get sort of focused on that concern when there might be other areas that are impacting that. But if we don't have a broad enough lens, we may overlook areas that could be important. So again, these are all tools that the facilitators use, but the information is really helpful for all of us to help clarify our thinking and get a picture of how things work. So more about the facilitation process. If you go to the Colorado Department of Education website, there is a page on alternative dispute resolution. If you are interested in learning more about facilitation, there's information on trainings in facilitation skills. Or if you are in a situation where you would like to have a facilitator come to your IEP meeting, this is the form where you request an IEP facilitator. And if you click on that link, there'll be a form to fill out. And this is the process. Once the facilitation request is received, again, the agreement of both parties is required. So they will make sure that both parties agree. If they don't agree, you can't go forward. It's also, if you think that facilitation is a direction that you would like to go, it's a good idea to let your district, if you're a parent, it's a good idea to let the district know, hey, I'd like to try this process. We're still trying to get the word out about this project, so there's some variation in what people know about the project. Sometimes people might be a little defensive if you make the request. So just the more you can explain is this is facilitative skills. We're finding it's helpful in all IEP meetings. So the more you can kind of communicate, again, communication is essential in all this. The more you can communicate about your request, the better it's likely to go. So in most cases, though, I believe both parties have agreed, but there are some instances where facilitation doesn't go forward. Once your facilitator is assigned, they will contact both the district and the parents at the same time, and they'll work to develop a mutually agreed upon agenda. The parties will have to agree and sign a form, and then the facilitator will begin the meeting, review the agenda, find out if there's anything missing or anything needs to be added. And then following the meeting, there's an evaluation. And again, just repeat, facilitators can do the annual IEP, but other IEP related meetings. And again, the facilitators are there for the process of the meeting to help keep the flow of communication going smoothly so that the team can focus on the substance. And they use a variety of techniques to do that. And we will be looking at those techniques in our upcoming 2 additional webinars in this series. So if you want to have additional information on the facilitated IEP process, Mary Ann Fleury is the Alternative Dispute Resolution Specialist at Colorado Department of Education. She has wonderful experience in this regard and is incredibly helpful and can give you more information about the process. If you have any questions about this webinar, I see I'm a little ahead of time. If you have any questions about this webinar, you can email me at awilson@peakparent.org. Or if you have questions specific to your situation or your child's IEP, you can contact the parent advisors at Peak Parent Center. I believe the email is parentadvisor@peakparent.org. And Pam can confirm that for me and let us know if there's some additional information.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, if you would like to reach a parent advisor, their email is parentadvisor@peakparent.org. You can also reach them by calling 719-531-9400. And Peak has additional resources available on our website, which is www.peakparent.org. As soon as we are able to add captions to this webinar recording, we will post it on our website. And to request a certificate of completion, please email me, Pam Christie, at pchristie@peakparent.org. That's PCHRISTY at peakparent.org. Thank you.
Oh, Pam?
Yes.
I just noticed, so I can only see, I could only see chat, not questions, but I see.
And I was able to answer all the questions. Thank you, Anne.
Oh, you were, okay, great.
Thank you. So thank you to our wonderful presenter, Anne, and to everyone attending. Again, as you exit the webinar, please take just a moment to complete our evaluation survey as we greatly value your feedback. We hope you join us next week for Identifying Sources of Conflict webinar. And then our last one will be of this series will be in May. So I hope you've signed up for all of those. On behalf of Peak Parent Center and today's presenter, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.